Hello and welcome to Ocean Education International's Professional Development Series. In this discussion, we will examine the topic, Doing the Right Thing, a Guide to Sustainable Diving Practice. This video lecture was designed with two purposes. Primarily, it's to support students in my Sustainable Dive Tourism courses. This includes my EcoPro course, which is a 6-day program on sustainable dive tourism that I teach at Sea Experience in Fort Lauderdale. The video also supports an expanded version of a new online course called Sustainable Dive Leader, which I created in partnership with the Ocean First Institute. However, some of you may not be enrolled students, but are here for general interest or to become a more savvy and employable dive professional. Regardless, all are welcome. If you are an enrolled student, you should already have received an orientation letter from me with a Dropbox link to your course materials. On that site, you'll find a PowerPoint version of this presentation in the folder marked PowerPoints. You can link directly from that presentation to all videos, articles, reports, and podcasts cited in this presentation. For those of you who are not enrolled students, here is a list of the videos and other resources we'll reference during the presentation. You can stop the video here and take a screenshot for future reference. However, I'll be happy to send you a document with hot links so you can avoid typing the extensive text in the URLs. I'll give you my contact information at the end of the presentation. To get the most out of this presentation, I encourage you to first read Section 4 of my book, Beneath the Blue Planet. The 3 chapters within this section will address many of the topics covered here. Although some of the information in my book is covered in greater detail than in this presentation, the presentation does include some information not covered in the book. In addition to reading Beneath the Blue Planet, I also suggest you consider completing the Green Fins Dive Guide e-course at this link. However, if you are enrolled in one of my Sustainable Dive Tourism courses, this is not an option but a requirement. So please enroll as soon as possible if you haven't already. This has become such a popular program that at some dive destinations, employers are now requiring of all applicants. Research tells us that most adults can maintain an effective attention span for about 15 to 20 minutes. Therefore, as this is a very long presentation, I encourage you to stop the video frequently for a break. Stop the video here and take a few moments to review what we'll discuss in this presentation. Note the chapters in Beneath the Blue Planet where these issues are also addressed. Let's begin by looking at how attitudes of divers have evolved over the years regarding how we interact with marine life. I'm going to show you a brief segment from one of the first films promoting the new sport of scuba diving back in the 1950s. It illustrates pretty clearly how divers once viewed wildlife interaction.
Wherever the naturalist turns, he finds life. If he wants to know the ocean, he must grasp it, meet it on its own terms. And the terms may not always be to his liking. He'll find more than he'll ever be able to classify in a lifetime.
Today, given our more responsible attitude toward wildlife, what you saw probably seems appalling. But even a decade after that video, images like this were still common. Stop here and take a moment to read the caption. I too was guilty of behavior that I'm not proud of today. These are images I shot back in the early 1980s. Here my wife is doing things we considered completely appropriate for the time, such as handling marine creatures and even chopping up those pesky pincushions called sea urchins that divers hated so much. Of course, today things have changed, or have they? The photos and video here were all taken within the past few years. To me, these images are as appalling as what we saw in the earlier clip from the 1950s. Here's an encounter filmed from a drone that questions just how much attitudes have really changed among tourists. Clearly, we need to be very careful about assuming that attitudes toward marine life interaction have changed that much. Hopefully, this type of behavior represents a minority of today's divers. As dive professionals, particularly those directly supervising divers, we can and must play a key role in shaping responsible attitudes and behavior toward marine life. One way you can accomplish this is by trying to instill a new mindset, shifting their expectations from being a customer to that of a guest. Although this may seem like nothing but semantics, it's actually an important distinction because guests respect and defer to their host and the local culture, and guests change their behavior to accommodate their host. Customers do not. Overall, this is a change in the egocentric mindset that humans are somehow above and separate from nature to the ecocentric mindset that we are part of nature. So as dive professionals, what are the behaviors we should try to achieve among our students and customers? Fundamentally, we want to instill an understanding that divers should act in ways that have as little impact as possible on the wildlife they encounter. But this also has its rewards, because keeping a low profile tends to have little impact on a creature's behavior. So this way, divers can have a more natural and intimate experience. Furthermore, inappropriate behavior or harassment isn't just an ethical issue. It also has consequences in terms of survival. As food is a limited resource for wildlife, all animals must operate within what's termed an energy budget. Although an organism may show no obvious signs of stress after an encounter with a diver, the diver probably won't be around to see the long-term consequence of their actions. Wasting energy through the stress of an unwelcome interaction can put an animal at higher risk of disease and predation. Touching or handling wildlife can be especially harmful, so like your mama told you, keep your hands to yourself. The idea is to enjoy an inspiring and engaging wildlife experience and not be an intrusion to the inhabitants. Finally, aside from actions, avoid even taking pictures of bad behavior, as this only implies to others that it's okay. The selfie phenomenon and social media's so-called influencers have unfortunately found their way underwater, and the entitlement it seems to foster in some individuals is increasingly problematic. Stop the video and read these comments from a study by wildlife tourism expert Dr. Chantal Pagel. You can also read more about the topic of wildlife harassment in Chapter 10 of my book, Beneath the Blue Planet. Incidentally, Dr. Pagel was one of the technical reviewers for that chapter. Aside from the ethics of harassing wildlife and its impact on the creature's energy budget, it is also a potential hazard to the diver. So back off if you see any signs of stress or avoidance, and never purposely elicit defensive actions. When animals are pursued, they will normally flee, but at some point, the flight response can become the fight response, as shown here. Surveys tell us that responsible behavior when interacting with wildlife has its benefits. The reason is, people are most satisfied with a wildlife experience based on 1, how much they learn about the wildlife, and 2, how natural they thought the encounter was. Today, most divers do not want some artificial Disneyland experience. My comments are not meant to imply that divers should avoid all interaction with wildlife. In fact, some interaction can't be avoided because it's at the initiative of the animal. The 2 photos here of the angelfish are examples. Absolutely nothing was done to encourage this encounter. It was the fish's decision. The same is true of the lower photo. Here, my wife has merely placed her hand near a ringed anemone. Then the Pedersen's cleaning shrimp elected to do his job, cleaning the cuticles of her fingernails. In my opinion, wildlife interaction is indeed appropriate when there are three criteria met. When the interaction is the animal's free choice, when the animal's natural behavior is not altered, and the experience is for more than pure entertainment. This last point means that all wildlife encounters, especially those facilitated by dive professionals, should have a clear educational objective. In Chapter 10 of Beneath the Blue Planet, you read that fish feeding, which is formally referred to as provisioning, is something to be avoided, and not just from the animal's perspective. Many instances of unprovoked bites, some involving serious injury, have occurred to divers feeding fish. Some encounters have even involved species that are normally quite harmless and docile. From the creature's perspective, the practice is ecologically disruptive. Some foods divers use may also cause problems either by disrupting the fish's digestive system or providing fewer calories than their natural food. Finally, as diving attracts more environmentally conscious participants, many find the Disneyland image of fish feeding both inauthentic and inconsistent with the dive professional's commitment to sustainability. Stop the video here and review the 5-point scene on the poster, Why We Don't Feed Fish. However, having said this, there are operators who nonetheless choose to include fish feeding as part of their tourist experience. In this case, I encourage you to follow the best practice guidelines established by Australia's Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, as shown here. Moving on from the subject of wildlife interaction, studies have confirmed that the single greatest reason for direct tourist-related damage to coral reefs is from anchoring. So the answer is simple. Don't use anchors unless absolutely necessary. The options are either drift diving or using moorings. An encouraging sign of growing environmental awareness is that moorings are becoming common in an increasing number of dive destinations. And the most common installation method in hard-bottom environments is the Hollis system, named for its inventor John Hollis. While these are far better options than anchoring, studies have shown that you should carefully consider the placement of moorings. The reason is, as referenced in this study here from the Cayman Islands, diver damage correlates to proximity to a mooring. So, when possible, moorings should be sited in locations well away from fragile reef structures and areas with high coral cover. Soft bottom environments require a different mooring system, such as the manta ray anchor. It has been suggested that in some cases, these may be a preferred alternative to traditional hard bottom moorings. The idea is that as divers use the mooring line as an aid to descent, or are told that it should be their start point for a dive, a soft bottom site is less vulnerable to damage during the first terrible 10 minutes of a dive, a phrase I'll explain in a few minutes. In wealthier nations, governmental entities typically finance, install, and maintain mooring systems. However, at many locations, the responsibility for installation and maintenance rests solely with the tourism operators, like the example here from Roatan. Responding to the need for funding, this is paid for through an innovative program whereby dive sites are named after the donor who sponsors the mooring. Here, the donation request is $1,500. As we'll see later, dive briefings can significantly influence diver behavior and mitigate environmental damage. But to be effective, they must be done in the right way. A briefing like, "There's the reef, don't touch the coral, and be back with 500 psi," just doesn't work. It has no impact. Here are some guidelines developed by the Greenfins program, available at the link provided along with other free resources. With all the concern over diver impact on coral reefs, reviewing what research tells us is useful. There have been well over 100 peer-reviewed studies on diver impact, so a rich literature on the topic is available. And if anyone is interested in specific references, please contact me. While there are variations in all studies, Here you see some of the typical findings. By the way, substrate contact doesn't necessarily mean damage to coral. It means contact with any bottom structure. However, some studies do distinguish a damaged versus undamaged contact. Stop the video and take a few moments to review the details. Like a death of a thousand cuts, this illustration dispels the myth that touching the reef a few times can't be all that bad. Also note in the chart at the lower right, divers are far more likely to contact the reef early on in the dive, which is why I like to call that period the terrible 10 minutes. There's a lot dive professionals can do to mitigate environmental damage long before divers enter the water. The more you know about your divers, the more effective you can be. A rusty, inexperienced diver can be just as clumsy as a novice, so try to determine when, where, and how long ago your customer's last dive took place. This can be done either by checking logbooks or, if that's not possible, through casual conversation. In addition, select dive sites in consideration of the diver's skill level. While this may be a challenge if there's a wide range of experience among the group, when possible, take this into account. In particular, avoid taking raw novices or those that have demonstrated poor skill performance to pristine areas or dive sites with high coral cover. Before entering the water, instruct divers, if possible, to descend over sand rather than directly onto the reef, and remind them to be careful as they approach the bottom to avoid making contact. A descent line is useful for this purpose, but warn them that mooring lines often are covered with stinging, fouling organisms like hydroids. Additionally, they should avoid swimming so close to the bottom that they create underwater dust clouds of silt. This can stress and even smother coral and other filter-feeding creatures. Be sure divers secure all hoses and other dangling equipment that might act like underwater wrecking balls on the reef. Encourage divers to maintain the magic meter, that is, remain about an arm's reach away from the bottom or other structures. While it's not a standard policy of all operators, when possible, provide in-water supervision, especially to novices and very inexperienced divers. Carefully observe them, looking for signs of poor buoyancy, anxiety, or inattentiveness. When observing inappropriate behavior, correct it immediately. Don't wait until after the dive. Alert your divers frequently to check the remaining gas supply, and always carry a device that will enable you to gain their attention immediately. You can help reduce future diver impact even after the dive. Through informal conversation, encourage divers to reflect on their experience and tactfully review any behavior you had to correct, along with how to avoid the issue in the future. Encourage them to ask questions about any creatures or phenomenon they observed that was new or that they didn't understand. You can often use this as a springboard to a more in-depth discussion about the environment and local conservation issues. As a way to reinforce the experience, encourage divers to record and keep a life list of what they observe in their logbook or other source, as shown here. Keep in mind these points when communicating your message to divers. People respond better to the positive than to the negative. So as the illustration shows, explain how to do something rather than not to do it. Use possessive words to build a sense of connection. For example, don't talk about the reef, but our reef. If you're lucky enough to have on your dive site resident charismatic animals, give them a name as another way to build connection. Finally, practice what you preach, because your actions can quickly nullify your words. If you doubt that your behavior has any real effect on your students and customers, stop the video and read these comments from a research study conducted on diver behavior in the Virgin Islands. Sometimes conditions warrant specialized equipment, such as reef hooks. When using them, caution divers to secure the hook only into rock or long dead coral, never into live coral or other living structure. Muck sticks should be used only as an aid to avoid more damaging contact with the reef. They are not intended as a way to manipulate or harass wildlife, nor to needlessly poke and prod around the reef. Your briefing should always include a special reminder to photographers about low impact. No matter the reason or how expensive the camera system, it never gives someone license to destroy the reef or disrupt its inhabitants just to get the perfect photo. With novices, discourage them from taking pictures if they have not yet developed good buoyancy control skills. Explain that the best photos often result from the photographer staying passively in place and allowing the fish to get accustomed rather than chasing them. And remind divers to be mindful of the reef when they concentrate on what's in their viewfinder. Finally, emphasize that taking photos does not give divers special permission to engage in inappropriate behavior. With the rise of digital cameras and the proliferation of so many divers taking photos, some assume damage from photographers mainly stems from novices. Indeed, novice photographers can be a concern, but don't ignore the serious photographer as shown here. Whether it's ignorance or apathy, scenes like this are both infuriating and heartbreaking. Here are some useful do's and don'ts for photographers. Like the previous dive briefing poster, this one is also available from the Greenfins Conservation Tools website. Stop the video here and briefly review each item. Some have questioned whether attempts to change diver behavior is, in the end, futile. However, there is evidence that it can be done, but only with the right approach. Shown here are highlights from a lengthy study from St. Lucia on the impact of pre-dive briefings. Stop the video here and review the researchers' observations. The study concluded, as you see, briefings alone are insufficient to reduce diver damage. Divers need close supervision, and dive leaders must manage diver behavior from in the water. The recommendations from the study are listed below. Note the need to intervene immediately if you observe bad behavior. Always lead by example, and be extra vigilant toward photographers, novices, and when night diving. Lastly, keep the group size small enough to maintain close supervision. Often, reef damage occurs because once a diver feels they've made contact with their fins, they nonetheless continue kicking. Sometimes they kick even more vigorously to get away from the reef. This, of course, only makes matters worse. Yet the problem is easily resolved with a simple stop and tuck maneuver, as the video will show you in a moment. Please consider adding this skill to your diver training courses.
Now you're ready to dive. Always stay aware of your environment and look where you're going. Descend slowly and stop your descent before contacting the reef. If you feel your fins accidentally contact the reef or sand bottom, practice the stop and tuck. To perform the stop and tuck, first, stop kicking right away. Second, tuck your knees towards your chest. Finally, scull with your hands to ascend to a safe distance from the reef. It's easy to avoid contacting the reef when you swim in the right position horizontally with your fins up. It's the most streamlined way to swim and conserves energy too. Relax and take your time exploring the coral kingdom.
We sometimes forget that dive professionals themselves can be a problem. Dive guides are sometimes torn between doing the right thing and actions they know are wrong but might result in a bigger tip. Hopefully, you'll act in the interest of the environment and conservation of the resource, because the future depends upon professionals with a strong moral code rather than concern for a quick personal reward. In the end, the choice is yours, and I hope it's a responsible one. Stop the video here to read and reflect on this comment from a study conducted in Indonesia. You should also be aware that your customers will watch you closely and sometimes report what they see. Here is a post from an online forum by a diver clearly incensed by the behavior like that mentioned in the previous slide. As I discussed in the Merging Business and Sustainability video, today's divers are different from what they were in the past. Some of the behaviors tolerated or even encouraged previously are now considered clearly out of bounds. Stop the video and read the details. Fortunately, examples of divers sitting on the reef or carving their initials in it are rare. Still, many dive professionals are reluctant to correct even such abusive behavior for fear it will cost them a tip, or my customers will complain. This is a foolishly short-sighted view, and hopefully you will do all you can to enforce responsible behavior by your customers. Stop the video and review the illustration at right. It provides an excellent overview on how to correct or even preclude problems from inappropriate or abusive diver behavior. Discussions with students and customers who engage in bad behavior can be quite awkward and sometimes confrontational. However, uncomfortable situations can be avoided using this or a similar document. Much like a liability waiver, it's a matter of informed consent. Long before an incident occurs, the document clearly explains what expectations are placed on all participants and that there may be consequences if the rules are ignored. This will fundamentally reframe the dynamic of any conversation that would arise because of bad behavior. It won't solve the problem, but it will make dealing with it more effective and probably less confrontational. Some operators have printed this on the back of their standard liability release form. But as you know, most people rarely read these releases, so be sure to remind divers of what they signed during your pre-dive briefing. Several years ago, this idea of informed consent was taken up by the North Sulawesi Water Sports Association. On the left is a statement that all association members agreed to post on their websites. On the right is the environmental awareness agreement that each operator requires their clients to sign. Stop the video and read both documents thoroughly. In the video, Merging Business and the Environment, I reviewed a comprehensive study of scuba divers and dive professionals' attitudes towards sustainability. One question asked of the dive professionals was, how can we improve diver training so that it is less damaging to the environment? Aside from the primary response of lack of environmental awareness and education, many respondents identified poor diver training and skills. As most of you watching will be instructors, I'd like to take a few minutes and explore how you might improve your diver training program so that students become not only more competent divers, but also much less likely to damage the environment. It can be argued that the single most important skill a scuba diver learns is how to control their buoyancy. However, as instructors, we know this is a skill students seem to find especially challenging. It has also become a very common topic of conversation among dive professionals, and many contend the reason for this failure is the lack of emphasis placed on this vital skill. Whatever the reason, divers often complete their certification without mastery. The chaotic scene depicted in the video is the consequence of inadequate training in buoyancy control. My plea to you as instructors is this: please begin teaching your students buoyancy control, proper trim, and propulsion techniques immediately. If they can accomplish this, other skills in the course will be a piece of cake. The concern for how to teach neutral buoyancy more effectively has become so common that there are now several resources to assist instructors willing to explore better ways. Here are links to 3 excellent discussions. Please review them at your leisure. This skill demonstration, conducted by an instructor maintaining perfect neutral buoyancy, shows what should be the goal of every diver. One way to start improving your students' buoyancy control is to stop having them kneel as they do their skills. This excellent podcast from the scuba guru himself, Tech Clark, discusses how this can be done. It's well worth the time to listen. Buoyancy control training raises a broader issue of exactly what constitutes skill mastery. Unfortunately, many instructors assume that doing a skill only once, and not necessarily well, fulfills the definition. As you see here from the training standards of one of the certifying agency, mastery requires that a skill be performed in a comfortable, fluid, repeatable manner as would be expected of a diver at that level. Getting the skill right once or even a few times does not demonstrate mastery. Yet another Tech Clark podcast dives deeply into this issue of mastery. In it, he explains why an open water certification course conducted over just 2 or 3 days cannot possibly fulfill the certification standards for skill mastery. Every scuba instructor should be required to listen to this outstanding discussion, as I hope you will. In teaching divers how to swim underwater, the flutter kick is the only technique taught in most courses. My plea is for instructors to add the frog kick as well, as demonstrated here. It has several advantages in that it is less likely to disturb the bottom, sending clouds of silt into the water column, stressing corals and other filter-feeding creatures. And it helps avoid leg fatigue and cramping by switching to a different muscle group. I believe if divers use the frog kick more often, this alone would significantly decrease the number of damaging fin kicks on coral reefs. Recently, a device called the buoyancy bar was introduced by an Italian-based diver training agency. This simple and easily constructed contraption enables divers to remain up in the water column, yet provides a way of maintaining stability as they initially learn a skill. This video demonstrates the use of the buoyancy bar in open water. For enrolled students, you'll find a video on your student materials website showing you how to construct the device. Of course, the importance of buoyancy control goes beyond concern for damaging the reef. It's critical to diver safety. Divers die primarily from drowning due to panic, exhaustion, or running out of air, problems that are easily prevented or overcome by good buoyancy control. Neutral buoyancy is, of course, a balance between the lift provided by the buoyancy compensator and the ballast of how much weight is worn. But as the illustration shows, control is determined not by the equipment worn, but by the manner in which the diver breathes. Also, remember that proper trim is often related not to the amount, but rather the distribution of weights. Emphasize the consequences of diving with too much weight in terms of comfort, poor trim, excess gas use, as well as environmental damage. And be sure to stay current with the latest technology and buoyancy control devices. At some time during your professional career, you'll probably supervise snorkelers as well as scuba divers. So it's worth discussing the unique aspects of dealing with this group. Snorkeling requires virtually no training, so snorkelers are typically much less aware of best practice, and many are marginally comfortable in the water, if at all. This often makes the task more challenging than supervising scuba divers. In terms of avoiding environmental damage, the best way is to keep it from happening, and this is simple. Just be sure to select dive sites where snorkelers cannot stand up, or, if they can, it's on sand. The Greenfins program provides this useful poster that you can display on board or at your facility to orient customers to the do's and don'ts of snorkeling. It's available as are other Greenfins materials, free of charge, and can be downloaded at the Greenfins Conservation Tool website. Most snorkeling operations advise or require that customers use some form of flotation aid, typically a snorkeling vest like the one shown here. Those with crotch straps tend to be more comfortable as they do not ride up under the user's chin. However, they all tend to place the user in a face-up position, which is not conducive to snorkeling, making the experience less enjoyable. As a result, many operators use other devices, such as the noodles depicted on the left, which provide a much more comfortable face-down position. Some operators do not even allow customers to wear fins, instead providing a large flotation device where they can rest and more easily be supervised, as depicted in the lower right. It's not uncommon during a diving holiday for people to consume seafood. As a dive professional, you can help them make a responsible choice in what they choose to eat. If you are an enrolled student, we will discuss at length the susceptibility of coral reefs to overfishing, which is a very common reason for their decline. So which species to avoid has great consequence on reef health. Generally, divers should avoid fish that are coral reef residents, particularly snapper, grouper, and parrotfish. Choose instead pelagic species, those that live out in the open ocean, such as dolphin, wahoo, tuna, and cobia. Of course, the other option, as shown here, is not to consume fish at all. Given their critical role as herbivores, parrotfish, the lawnmowers of the reef, are critical to a healthy ecosystem. While in many locations these are protected from fishing, this is not the case universally, and you will often find them on a tropical restaurant menu. So don't be a tourist hypocrite by eating these vital species. And if you think parrotfish are not heavily targeted, this image from just one Caribbean seafood market proves otherwise. Most seafood guides do not cover tropical locations. However, the one seen here, developed by a consortium of environmental organizations, is one of the few that does so. Stop the video here and review the details. It's particularly sad to see this photo of a group of American spearfishers with one holding a large rainbow parrotfish. For those visiting tropical locations, sun protection is critical, so the use of sunscreen is strongly advised. However, the compounds within many sunscreens can be damaging to both the user and to the environment. In fact, many of the compounds, particularly oxybenzone, can be devastating to organisms such as corals, even at minute concentrations, as described in the comments here. Take a moment to read through the details. Here you see the highly toxic effects of oxybenzone and other chemicals in that family. These are herbicides and therefore disrupt the photosynthetic mechanism of the coral symbiotic algae known as zooxanthellae. They also make corals more susceptible to bleaching, damage their DNA, cause abnormal skeletal growth and deformities in juvenile corals. In the upper right, you see just how the larvae are deformed. Stop the video and review the details. You can minimize the use of sunscreens by encouraging your customers to cover up. By wearing a broad-billed hat and rash guard, they can avoid any need to apply sunscreen to most of their body. A responsible choice in selecting sunscreen products begins by knowing what chemicals to avoid, as shown here. This chart lists harmful sunscreen compounds, indicating which are health hazards versus hazards to the environment. You may wish to take a screenshot for further reference. Some locations are now taking proactive measures and outright banning sunscreens containing environmentally damaging compounds. Palau and Hawaii are two examples. Many divers never consider that some of the choices they make when purchasing souvenirs can be far more damaging than anything they'll do while diving. Of course, the purchase of shells, coral, and other marine curios contribute to a market demand which ends up having damaging ecological consequences. But even other choices seemingly unrelated to the ocean can have equally damaging consequences. At right are carvings on sale in Bali made of tropical hardwoods. Purchase of such items provides incentive to remove these valuable and important resources from the forest. Lacking the trees to hold soil in place, torrential tropical rain washed soil into the nearshore waters and out to the reef, wreaking havoc by smothering it. From a broader perspective, the problem wrought by deforestation is illustrated here. Clearing of tropical rainforest for palm oil production and cattle ranching. And if you think palm oil isn't in high demand globally, check the ingredients in many of the food products you purchase the next time you're at the grocery store. The problem is widespread in Asia. In the Western Hemisphere, large-scale clear-cutting of the Amazon rainforest is why Brazil will soon overtake the United States as the world's largest cattle producer. Nutrient enrichment and sedimentation from deforestation of both the Amazon and Orinoco River watersheds not only impact coral reefs, but also contribute to the high nutrient levels driving massive sargassum blooms in the South Atlantic. This is now the largest harmful algal bloom on Earth. So, if you want to make a difference, encourage your customers and students to try and avoid foods containing palm oil and cut back on the hamburgers and steak. While it might not seem related, one meatless day per week could go a long way in protecting coral reefs and the ocean in general. One outstanding tool in creating more environmentally responsible divers is the e-course offered by the Greenfins program. I encourage you to consider making it a part of your diver training program, perhaps even adding it as a component of your open water course. It's available at the link provided. Stop the video here and take a few moments to learn more about the program. To those watching who might be employed or considering employment in the Florida Keys, the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary operates an outstanding program promoting responsible practice among local operators called the Blue Star Program. I encourage you to review the video at this link explaining it. The purpose of this presentation can be summed up in a famous quote by anthropologist Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. It's wonderful that governments establish conservation goals and objectives, and NGOs try to advance those objectives. But real change comes down to actions taken by, as Margaret Mead said, groups of small individuals. This is where dive professionals come into the picture, because you are out there every day in the trenches with citizens who will vote and will ultimately decide the future of the ocean we all love. You, more than any other group, can help instill environmentally responsible attitudes and behaviors in those you encounter in your day-to-day interaction with customers. While it may seem like your job as a dive master or an instructor is the low man on the industry totem pole, nothing could be further from the case. You are where the rubber meets the road, and over the course of your career, you can have more positive impact than any scientist, resource manager, or NGO. So please take this vital role seriously. This is not a hobby, this is your profession. In closing, if you have any questions or feedback regarding this program or other programs offered by Ocean Education International, please feel free to contact me as indicated here. Thank you for your time, and please accept my best wishes for a long and successful career.